Congratulations.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, great job, kiddo.
Thanks, Grandpa.
So, what's your 15-year plan?
Oh no, not this again.
Do you have a job yet?
Give me some time. Every time he comes over, he makes me feel like a kid again.
I don't know. Jobs seem hard.
Your estimated wait time is 97 minutes.
97 minutes? Come on!
All right, here it is. I pulled the MLS data on this luxurious short sale, and it seems to be priced pretty appropriately according to the CMA, and depending on your DP, you may not even have to pay PMI.
Huh? She really is beautiful.
Thank you. Got it?
Congratulations again.
Thank you.
You got it from here, okay? All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Honey.
Sir, what's your number?
What number?
Next.
I thought refills on juice were free.
I'll go ask my manager.
Good.
Oh my gosh, I am so sorry. Oh my goodness, are you okay?
Adulting is hard.
You know, something I've said my whole life is right up here, is once I, then I. Once I, then I. Once I get through this season, then I'll feel so much better. You know, once I accomplish this thing, oh my gosh, then I'll finally feel that sense of freedom. I've just said this my whole life. In fact, I remember when I was a little boy, growing up, I thought to myself, once I get that really cool bike, then once I, accomplish this one thing and win that race, oh my gosh, then all my friends are going to think I'm so cool. Or this is going to date me a little bit. I used to think to myself all the time, once I get this certain Garbage Pail Kid card, you guys remember these way back in the day? I mean, this was like cold cash, man. If you had one of these things or a big old stack, it was awesome. And I always used to think, man, once I get that certain card, man, then I have arrived. And I've just said that my whole life from the time of, being in elementary, middle school, high school, once I turned 16, get my car, that whole thing, in college. And then out of college, once I kind of moved in that adulting season, and had more responsibilities, something else I always used to say was this, is once I make $50,000 a year, then I'll feel rich. You guys ever said that? I mean, I used to say this all the time, and then I got a job at Dell, and this actually happened. I made $50,000 in a year, and man, I felt so good about it. In fact, I did what people do once you cross that $50,000 mark. I took all my friends out to TGI Fridays. You guys ever do that? And I bought them all dinner, and I was like, man, this is so cool. Like, what an accomplishment. And it felt good. It really did, buying them dinner, hanging out. But then life happened, then there's, rent, and there's my car payment and auto insurance and, utilities and medical bills. And then my whole fun category, my whole fun budget, back then it was really, really big. And I was like, man, I love to have fun. And then all of a sudden, MasterCard and Visa starts getting mixed in the whole thing. And before long, I thought to myself, man, $50,000, man, that's not a lot of money. I need to make it a little bit more. And I thought, I would think this all the time. And then, during that time as well, not only did I think this or did I say this, but I also said this. I said, once I get married, then I will feel complete. Then I will have my Jerry Maguire moment. You complete me. And so I'm at Dell and I'm working. I'm looking for that perfect girl. And, I meet this amazing woman named Jill. And she was so stunning. She is stunning. And so, we meet. A few months later, we get married. And in fact, we got married here in Austin. This is Jill and I. Look at her. She's so gorgeous. I'm not sure what am I trying to bite her? Is that kind of like, not sure what that whole thing's about. But we got married here in Austin at River Place Golf Course. We both love golf. And, it was awesome. Once I get married, then I experienced so many of those feelings. Jill experienced those feelings. We had such a, it's amazing, amazing. But then life happened. We're married a few months, and all of a sudden, things begin to happen in my life. And she began to see some things come out of me. And one of the things that she constantly saw on the other side of me was just, my numbness. Like I was just fairly numb, and when life would get hard, work would get hard, family things would get hard. All I wanted to do was like veg out. Like, hey, I just want to watch a bunch of, TV or be on my, device, and I just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. I'll figure it out. And she would always ask me a question. She would say, hey, babe, how you doing? And my constant response to her was, I'm fine. I'm fine. Just, I'll figure it out. I'm fine. I'm fine. And then I remember in our marriage, our very first, like just big old blow up. And we happened to be at a candy store. And at candy stores, you should be happy. I mean, this is like, that whole thing, right? But for whatever reason, I can't even remember why we had this big old blow up. But I remember we left the candy store, got in our car, and Jill and I were just getting after it. And then all of a sudden, I just lost it. This is the first time in front of Jill that, she began to see this rage come out of me. She began to see, my voice was not just raised, I was full-fledged yelling. And that was happening all of a sudden. It was like, one side then we experience those feelings. It's amazing. But now life is happening and things are getting a little bit hard. And so Jill and I did what you do when marriage gets hard. We said we should have kids. And so that's what we did. And now moved from one side to once we. So once we have kids, we thought, then we'll feel happy. That's going to be awesome. And so that's what we did. Jill got pregnant and, Sam came along, our first son. He's now 16 years old. There he is. Look at him. And I remember when Sam was born, it was amazing. I was just sitting there in the hospital. And if you're a parent, you've had these moments, you're just looking at him. And I'm like, that's my son. That's like my flesh, my bone. Like he's right there. He's got that big old German nose like his father. That's awesome. I'm looking at him just going, this is so surreal. And I really did feel those feelings like this is the coolest thing ever. But then a couple days later, we brought him home and I decided I was going to change my first diaper. And I was super pumped about it. And so I bring him into his room, put him on his changing table, the whole thing, take his diaper off, put it in that big old weird trash can thing. And I turn around and I start getting his supplies. And as I'm turned around, I start hearing this like kind of, like a faucet, something running over here. And I turned back around and I did not see a drip. I saw Niagara Falls coming out of my son. I was like, what is going on? And so I tried to, calm the whole thing down. It was just got everywhere. And I thought to myself in that moment, I'm like, man, so many amazing things. But in that moment, I said, man, it's getting hard. It's getting hard. And so Jill and I did what you do when parenting gets hard. We had more kids. And so we, ended up with a total of 5 boys. And it's from a picture a while ago, but that's when they were younger. And at one time, we actually had 5 sons that were 6 years old and younger. And guys, I'm just telling you, it's so many amazing feelings, so many amazing moments, so many amazing, like just snapshot those the rest of your life looking at our sons. We love being parents. But at the same time, the reality is life happens, right? And that numbness inside of me, that was kind of bumping out the older that my boys are getting, they're starting to feel that. And that whole thing about rage and yelling and, I just need to control everything, that started coming out. And they started feeling that. And, life happened. And I just continued to tell myself, I just said, well, I'll just keep moving on. One side, then I. And I think we've all done that. I think we've all said this. Once I meet that guy or once I meet that girl, once I get that job, once I make that amount of money, once we move into that house we've always wanted, once we get those cars, once I get to retirement. And that's fine. That's wonderful. And you've tasted that. You've experienced the one side then I. That's really good stuff. But there's always this other dynamic at play, isn't there? There's always this dynamic at play that life is getting more complicated. The older that we get, some things are kind of coming out. And the reality is, there's a dynamic that says adulting is hard. And so what is this whole term adulting? Because this is kind of a new term. What does this mean? Well, the definition for adulting is this. It's the practice of behaving in a way characteristics of a responsible adult, especially the accomplishment of the mundane but necessary tasks. So as life gets, more complicated, as you take on more responsibility, there's a bigger, mortgage, more relationships to manage, then, extended family, some kind of odd things happen. You discover more about your extended family. As all those things are happening, it's this idea to go, man, I'm almost maintaining perfection. It's like my character never changes. It's like I'm just, steady Eddie the whole time. And that's just not reality, is it? Because life happens. Bumps happen. And adulting, there's a whole dynamic that's very, very hard. And honestly, I think one of the things for me personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I think one of the things that makes adulting hard, and in fact, I would argue to say, I think this is the thing that makes adulting far harder than it needs to be, is what I call the emotional age gap. The emotional age gap. Now, let me try to explain what the emotional age gap is. So as we think about it, I'm going to write it up here. I'm going to share with you a little bit of my story, And if you've come to North Point, you've heard this before, so there's going to be parts of my story that you've gone, oh yeah, I've heard you share this book. But in order just to explain this, give it a little bit more context, I want to share with you something that happened to me in 2012. So in 2012, here's a picture of my mom and a picture of my favorite grandfather. And my favorite grandfather, he's the guy who taught me to fish. He had such adventurous stories. He traveled the world. I mean, on the other side of him, you would just go, gosh, I've never really lived, because, I mean, just how much life he lived. It's just incredible. And so I loved hanging out with him. And then there's my mom. That's his daughter. And in 2012, my grandfather passes away from cancer. And 2 weeks later, his daughter, my mom, passes away from cancer. And then after my mom passes away from cancer, my father is no longer filtered by my mother. So it's my unfiltered father. And eventually he walks away from my sister and I. And within the span of about a year, basically I lose my whole family. And so Jill's on the other side of me, and Jill's doing what, just a person who loves and cares does. She's asking me, hey, how are you doing? How are you processing it? I mean, are you okay? Are you okay? And here was my response to her. I'm fine. I'm fine. Leave me alone. I'll figure this out on my own. I'm a pastor. I'm going to Bible this thing. I'm going to out-pray this thing. I'm going to out-memorize everybody else. I'm going to out-read it. I'm going to get more knowledge. I'm going to get smarter. I'm going to work harder. And I did that. And guys, that's part of it. I mean, that's helpful stuff. But at the end of the day, my numbness just got more numb. And that whole idea of these things coming out of me, that just continued to grow and got on Jill and it got on my boys, and I'm watching this whole thing and I can't figure it out and I'm stuck. And then I did the thing that I thought I would absolutely never, ever do. I did the thing that I always perceived was weakness. I sat on the other side of a counselor. And I began to tell my story, and my counselor, began to ask me and said, hey, tell me a little bit more about your life. And so, this is over the course of weeks and weeks and months. And so we talked about my dad, my relationship with my dad. And then we talked about Jill and I and our marriage and, our relationship. Then we talked about my sons and, all 5 of them. And hey, how's this thing going? And as we talked about my dad, she said, hey, tell me your kind of earliest memories when it comes to your dad. And I said, or the last conversation, because, I hadn't seen my dad. Tell me about that last conversation. So I told her about this last conversation. I said, my dad and I, and this was when I was probably about 36 years old. I said, my dad and I, our last conversation when I was 36. And it was at a restaurant. And my mom had passed away. And so we're talking. And I said something to my dad that he didn't like. And anytime I told him something he didn't like, he would explode. And we're in a very public setting. And he begins to explode in this restaurant. Everybody can hear it. And he's calling me all kinds of names you should never call a son publicly. And he's saying all kinds of things, and he's getting this rage to control me. And I said, the wildest thing happened, as my dad is doing this, 36 years old, I felt completely powerless. I had no power. In other words, I lost all the air in my lungs. Like I should be able at 36 years old to say, Dad, enough is enough. Stop. I couldn't do it. I lost all rational thinking. Like I couldn't connect rational, logical dots in my mind because of what he was doing in that moment. And then my counselor did something that just surprised me. I was like, what? What does this mean? My counselor asked me this question. How old do you feel? Like in that moment, how old did you feel with your dad? And I thought, well, that's strange. But the honest truth, I felt young. I said, if I had to guess, maybe I was, 10 years old. That's kind of how I felt. And then we talked about Jill and I, and I said, well, Jill, if she's here and she was with us, she would say the number one thing I see in my husband is this, he's numb. And I ask him all the time how he's doing, and he's just, I'm fine, I'll figure it out. I'm strong enough, powerful, I'll figure it out. And she felt pretty lonely on the other side of that. And then my counselor said, well, how long's that's happened? And I said, well, pretty much our whole marriage. So the time, I'm 23, to the time, at this point, I'm about 37 years old. And then she asked me the question again. How old do you feel? When she asks you that and you're like, I'm fine, leave me alone. How old do you feel? I thought, And that took me a long time to figure out. And eventually I got to the place to go, I actually feel younger. I actually feel like maybe I'm 8 years old when I say this. And then we talked about my sons, and I said, well, if there's one thing they would describe our relationship as, it's one word, control. My father wants control. And he will use words of shame, and he will yell to gain control. She said, well, how long has that been happening? I said, pretty much their whole childhood, from the time I was pretty much 27 years old when we started having kids to 37. And the question again, how old do you feel? How old? I go, I don't know. I feel a little bit older. I feel a little bit more powerful in that moment, when those happen. I said, maybe about 17. And so then we did the exercise. And she said, okay, take your oldest age, as we work through these, what's the oldest point? So, 37 years old is my oldest point here. And my oldest point emotionally was 17. And she talked about this emotional age gap to where on this hand we have the physical age, on this side we have the emotional age. And she says that gap right there, she said the bigger the gap, the greater or the more difficult adulting is. And guys, you've all experienced that. You've all felt that. I mean, you've seen this. You've been on the other side of somebody that you love, somebody that you care about, and you reflected something to them. Hey, can we talk about this? Small conversation, not a big deal, but can we talk about something? And you reflect it to them, then all of a sudden they just blow up at you, and they're giving you all the excuses why what you said is wrong, and they're just deflecting, and you're sitting there on the other side of them watching them just blow up over something small. And you're like, you're 40 years old, but you're acting like you're 20. What's that all about? I mean, you've seen this especially in some guys. I mean, guys who don't get what they want. Like, I didn't get what I wanted, and I still wanted that for a long time, and I didn't get it. And they walk around pouting. And you're like, okay, let them be human. You can pout for a day or two, but now it's 3 days or 4 days, and they're still pouting. And you're looking at them, and you're like, you're a 45-year-old man. I mean, you're acting like you're 15 years old. I think we've all experienced that. And the challenge is, the difficulty is, guys, the bigger this gap is here, the more difficult, the harder adulting will become. So the question is, what do you do with that? Is there anything you and I can do, regardless if you're a Christian or not? Is there anything we collectively can do to close the gap? Is there anything we can do to what Paul tells us to do? The Apostle Paul, I love what he says. Can we do this? He said, when I was a child, I spoke about childish matters, for I saw things like a child and reasoned like a child. There was that season of life, yes, but something happened. But the day came when I matured and I set aside my childish ways. Is that possible? Is that possible for you? Is it possible to close the gap? The good news, again, regardless if you're a Christian or not, the good news is it is possible. It is. The good news is there's an individual by the name of King Solomon who spoke into this whole dynamic. And if you don't know who King Solomon is, King Solomon lived about 1,000 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. So imagine that in a kind of a timeline in your mind. There it is, 1,000 years. Here's King Solomon. King Solomon was the third king of Israel. And he had a very famous father, and his father was King David. Maybe you heard the story of David and Goliath, that whole story. That's King David. Well, his son was King Solomon. And when King Solomon ruled the nation or ruled Israel, I mean, he issued in or kind of ushered in the whole golden age of Israel, where Israel experienced more peace, power, and prosperity than it had ever seen before or after. Who led during that time? That's King Solomon. And the thing that's so unique about the life of King Solomon is God gave Solomon something he'd given no human being before or after. In fact, look at this. This is where it says, God says to Solomon, I will give you a wise and discerning heart so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Solomon, I'm giving you something I've never given to a human being before, and I'll never give it again. I'm giving it to you. Discernment and wisdom. You'll be able to see life in such a dynamic way. You'll be able to connect dots in life like no other before you. And this is one of the reasons why, if you've come to North Point before, I've said, hey, let's talk about King Solomon, the smartest man, the wisest man who ever lived. And what's so cool for you and I is we actually have ancient documents that talk about King, or give us insight what King Solomon said. In fact, one of those ancient documents it's called Proverbs. And proverb literally means wise statement. It's like these insightful statements. It's like when somebody says something, you're like, man, that was brilliant. How long did you think about that? Well, Solomon, one after another, after another, after another, just had these brilliant statements, brilliant kind of thought-provoking connection points of life about marriage and about friends and about money and about work and just about life. And in this ancient document of Proverbs, he leans into our conversation. And here's what he says. Above all else. That Solomon says, this guy who knows all about meaning and purpose and life and relationships and marriage and parenting, the whole thing. He says, listen, as I think about it all, above all else, the most important thing you and I could ever do in this life is to guard your heart. Now, guys, in the last 10 years, I've talked about this passage 3 other times, but we could talk about it every other week. Because if Solomon is right, if he's right, if he says, hey, above all else, guard your heart is the source of life. Your heart is the source of your meaning, of love, of joy, of peace, of contentment, of your reasoning, of your purpose, of your decision-making. It's the wellspring of life. If Solomon's right, and he says, hey, the most important thing that you and I could do is discover what's in there, is to guard our heart, then we should talk about this all the time. And the question is, well, Solomon, why is this so important to guard our heart? And he tells us, he goes, because everything you do flows from it. Everything in life, all of your decisions, all those times you said, oh, how could I have said that? How could I have done? The way you treat your wife, the way you treat your husband, the way you treat your kids, the way you handle your finances, the way you make decisions about God, everything Solomon would say, it comes from the source, this wellspring within you. And then 1,000 years later, Jesus comes and punctuates this. And Jesus says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the overflow of the heart, you do. It all comes from here. And the implication to this is significant. The implication is that what's inside of you is going to come out. And what's inside of you will eventually come out of you, especially in your adulting years. And you guys have seen this. I mean, you see this little boy or little girl, and you see them struggle with the little things, and you see their temperament or their disposition, and you're like, I see that. But in the adulting years, because of the pressure of life, because of the complexity of life, because things, whatever happens, that's when it begins to manifest itself more and more and more. And certainly we can cover it up, and certainly we can say, hey, I can manage this. But it's not neutral. What's in you, it's going to come out of you. Even if you numb it down, like I would do, you can numb it down. Well, it's still coming out on my kids. It's still coming out on my wife. It's still coming out of me. It's not neutral. And it comes out in your adulting years. And it comes out on people, regardless who's with you. This is your friends. This is colleagues. This is people at work, people at school. These are your neighbors, your extended family. This is your legacy. This is your reputation. This is what you're known for. It's going to come out of you. And the reason why this is so important is because it's going to come out in relationships that are most important to you. Your son, you'll give your life for him. Your daughter, you'll give your life for her. Your husband, your wife, your best of friends, your family, your mom, your dad. And it's going to come out of you and of me. And when it does, because it will, and it begins to complicate life, and the adulting gets hard, and now relationships are hard, and things are hard. Do you know what our tendency is to do when things get hard? Our tendency in life, and I'm so guilty of this, is to blame. It's her fault. I mean, if he would just, if my boss would just, if my parents would just, then I. And guys, I'm not by any means dismissing their behavior. That is part of the discussion, but today I'm talking about you. And I'm talking about you, and I'm talking about me. And guys, this is so important to understand. And I want to be sensitive with what I say next. But I'm just telling you, you've got to lean in. Because there is something that is so for you that God wants for you. And here's what I want you to hear. Is that your ability to feel what you want to feel is determined by the condition of your heart. Let me say it again. Your ability in your life to feel what you so want to feel in here is determined by what's going on in here. Not by her, not by him, not by them, not by they. And guys, please hear me. I'm not saying and dismissing what they did or what he did or she did. You know, that's part of the whole discussion. But today I'm talking about you and I'm talking about me. And there is something you and I can do about what's going on in here. And you have the power. You are way more powerful than you think. In fact, you have the power to actually get up, put your feet firmly on the floor, pull your shoulders back, take steps forward, and unlock the door, because the lock is on the inside of the door. It's not on the outside. You're not locked in that room. Now listen, I'm not going to play with you, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this. If you're going to move forward and begin to guard your heart and begin to discover what's in here and deal with what's in here, it's going to require you to be more brave than you've ever been. It'll require you to be more daring than you've ever been, more courageous, more vulnerable. It will require you to perhaps do things that are harder than you've ever done in your life, and it may get far worse before it gets better. But if you don't deal with what's going on here, it will get on the people around you. You will process it on the people you love the very most. So how do we do it? If we're really going to get to the bottom of this, and if we can begin to feel what we so desire to feel, and we have the power to actually do that, then how? Well, Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, said, above all else, guys, guard your heart. So what does this mean practically? I mean, if we're going, I want to feel these things. I want to move forward. I want to be alive. Yes. What does this look like? Well, in the context and in the vein of this discussion we're having today, I would say there's three questions you've got to be willing and vulnerable and daring to ask. And the first question is this, is when you bump into that feeling that makes adulting so difficult in your relationships, whatever it is, it's to name it. What do I feel? When you bump into that feeling that's in your marriage, in your relationships, in life, whatever it is, that you're like, oh man, what is that? Instead of rushing by that feeling so quick, instead of saying, I know, I just want to cover it up and I want to move on. I want to feel good, so I'm just going to move on. Well, if you want that, you got to ask this question and pause long enough in life to go, what is that? I keep bumping into it. You know, I think it's anger. I think it's loneliness. I think I just feel disgusting. Now, I'm just telling you, if you're willing to name it, that is more than half the battle, because you're finally dealing with it versus moving on. Now, listen carefully. One of the reasons why we don't do this, and I get it, guys, but one of the reasons why we don't want to do this, and sometimes we're like, oh, that's just so fluffy and whatever, I'm not going to do that, is because if you're willing to pause long enough in life and begin to deal with that emotion that keeps making adulting hard, then it's going to lose its power and you're going to lose your excuse. You're going to lose your excuse to continue to punish her for what she's done. You're going to lose your excuse to continue to punish him for what he's done. You're going to lose your excuse to continue to keep them at bay and keep them at a distance. And you know what? I'm going to control you. I'm going to control her. I'm going to control him. And it's like a security blanket, that emotion. That maybe there's something inside of you that says, I ain't going to let that go. I'm going to hold on to it, because as long as I hold on to that emotion, I can control him, her, punish him, punish her. And you're free to continue to hold that emotion. You are. But that's just going to perpetuate the brokenness and hardness of the adulting years. There's something you can do. And I'm telling you, if you're willing to maybe think of this, as your heart, if you're willing to go, okay, I'm going to pause long enough and what is this? I'm going to pull it out. And I'm going to begin to look at this emotion. And I'm going to discover that perhaps this emotion right here, perhaps it's discontentment. Maybe it's that thing. Maybe that's what's been going on. I'm so discontent, so it's making adulting so much harder. And if it is discontentment, if this is what you begin to recognize, and it's kind of a lack of joy, then the antidote to discontentment is generosity. The antidote to a lack of joy in your life is gratitude. And maybe this is as far as you go with this exercise, and you're like, man, I keep bumping into this, and it's contentment or discontentment. And so you know what I'm going to do? Every week, I'm going to intentionally do things to remind me to be more generous. Every day I'm going to get up and I'm going to write 2 things down on a piece of paper, put it on the refrigerator that I am so incredibly grateful for. And I'm just telling you, if you just do that with this one emotion of discontentment, of a lack of joy, if you just do that, give it some time, you'll feel more joy and you will feel more contentment. But maybe that's not what's going on in you. Maybe for you it's unappreciated. Maybe for you, you just feel hurt, you feel numb, you feel distrust, like I'll never trust a man, I'll never trust a woman as a result. Maybe you feel rejected, unworthy, disgusting, lonely, fearful. Maybe there's a whole lot of fear that's driving you. Or maybe it's sadness, or you're empty, or you just feel powerless. Whatever it is, would you be willing to pause long enough and say, what is this? And then once you identify it, then it's to be willing to ask a second question. This is the question my counselor asked me. And this is just going to require time. It really will. But this question, how old do I feel? Oh man, I'm so hurt. Well, how old do you feel? When was the first time you started feeling this? Who was it with that you began feeling this feeling? This requires that introspective work. This is not an overnight process. This is why it's going to require you to be vulnerable, daring, brave, and courageous. And guys, the reason why this is so important is because healthy people, emotionally healthy people, if you're on the other side of somebody who's emotionally healthy, isn't it so refreshing? Isn't it like they can sit with you and they never have to fix you, but they can just sit with you? I mean, you show me somebody who can do that, man, they've done the work. And on emotionally healthy people, what emotional health is, it's not only knowing what you feel, it's knowing where the feeling came from. That's the definition of emotional health. I know exactly why I feel so much loneliness, and I know exactly where it came from. You got to ask the question, how old do I feel? And then last of all, who will I tell? Who will I tell? See, you are hardwired, physiologically hardwired to be connected. You can't do this alone. I promise you, if you could do it alone, I would have found a way to do it alone. You can't. You are biologically hardwired. Take God out of the equation if you'd like. When you look at the science, you are hardwired for connection in your life. You've got to talk about it. You've got to tell someone. And when I talk about telling someone, I'm not talking about, hey, just be flippant about it. Go on social media. Hey, my Pastor Buck, he's saying these questions, and so I'm going to post all my feelings. Don't do that. Don't go up to somebody that you just met and say, hey, my name's Buck. Nice to meet you. Hey, do you know I'm numb? I'm just trying to be vulnerable here. I'm numb all the time. Do you know that? That is not wise. That's not what I'm talking about. Come on. These are your feelings. This is your story. This is valuable information. So you got to tell somebody. You can't do this whole thing alone. It may be a mentor that you need to have this conversation with. It may be a really good friend in life that's just much further ahead of you because they've gone through those traumatic or hardships and they've done the work before. It may be that individual. It may be a mom. It may be a dad. It may be a religious leader. It may be a pastor. Or maybe when you begin to do the work and you find something and you're like, oh, this is so significant and so heavy. It may be somebody that I chose to go to. It may be a professional counselor. And you may have to make a decision and say, hey, I know it's expensive. I know it's going to require time, but man, this is my life. This is my life. I only get one shot at it. And it may require you to get on the other side of a professional counselor. And there's a lot of great counseling organizations. There's a lot of great counselors in Austin. Just one, really good organization is Center for Relational Care. There's some great counselors, a great group of counselors. This may be your next step. This may be the place that you go, who do I need to tell? Who do I need to tell? I need to spend the time unpacking it with somebody who understands my emotions and understands how they're connected in life. Guys, to wrap this up, let me just tell you why this is so important. I've been on the other side of people who I've watched go through this process. I've watched them be vulnerable, be daring, be brave, and I've seen the outcome. And it doesn't lead to perfection. It doesn't mean life's like nirvana, like, ooh, we've arrived. Or it just makes it so much better. And I've seen it in my personal life. I think about my story. I think about my dad. And when my counselor was like, how old do you feel? And I was like, 10 years old. And then she said, well, tell me about that. And I just began to talk about my father. And my father, the way that, he parented me was from a perspective of control. That he just wanted and had to have control. And he would say anything to my sister and I, do anything he possibly could to get control. And he would say the worst of things that you can imagine to me, and he would say the worst of things to my sister. And if we didn't like what he said or we pushed back against what he had to say, he would amp up everything, and there would be so much rage, and whatever he had to do to get control, he would do. And it absolutely robbed my power as a little boy. And we talked about that. And I worked through some steps and stages of forgiveness over time. That's a lot of time. And then, just a few years ago, I sat there at Dos Salsas, just a restaurant down the road, after I hadn't seen my dad in about a year and a half. And I sat there, and on the other side of my father, for the first time in my life, I had air in my lungs. And I had the ability to have rational thinking. And I said to my father, Dad, let me tell you what it's been like to grow up on the other side of you. And today, my dad and I's relationship, it's not perfect, but it's the best it's ever been. We're as close as we've ever been in my entire life. With Jill, when my counselor asked me about this idea, hey, you're 8, tell me more about that. I said, well, the first time I remember feeling like, it's just not okay to feel any longer is when, I would share feelings with my mom and say, hey, Mom, I skinned my knee, or hey, Mom, I'm being bullied at school, or hey, Mom, and I'm processing and sharing. And my mom, I love her. She's amazing, but she was so busy and so driven. And when I would try to share feelings with her, her famous saying, she would say this all the time, Buck, suck it up. Buck, suck it up. Buck, suck it up. And do you know how painful it is to get your feelings out here, to be incredibly vulnerable, and then somebody comes and just smashes them? As an 8-year-old little boy, I didn't know how to process this. So I just told myself when I was really young, I'll never feel again. I choose to never feel again. It's not safe to feel. So my counselor and I talked about this and, talked about that's a myth, that you're designed to be fully alive. You're designed to feel. Worked through some steps and stages of forgiveness, and today with Jill, I still struggle with this. But I'm telling you guys, today with Jill, I begin to share some feelings and I'm discovering, oh my gosh, she has so much wisdom. Like when I begin to share, man, I'm stressed at work, I'm nervous about this, or I have this fear. And it's inviting her in, and her insight and her wisdom to meet my heart. It's amazing. And we today experience more intimacy, more authentic intimacy in our relationship than we've ever experienced. And intimacy is the magic ingredient to great marriages. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm just saying there's a place, there's intimacy we've just never experienced to the degree we do. Last of all, with my sons, this whole idea of control and shame, yelling, I discovered that was my father's voice, and I just repeated what my father did with me. But the thing I did different is I just put a big umbrella of religion around it. And I just said, the scriptures say, hey, train a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't turn from it. Okay, I'll do that. And boys, you need to be perfect. I'm the pastor, by the way. Everybody's looking at my family. And so I did that for the first 10 years of their life. And then I began to have these discussions. I began to answer some questions and look at what's going on inside of me. And oh my gosh, I've shared this with you guys. It's my greatest regret in life. My greatest regret is what I did to my boys. And then I owned it. And I sat down with my sons on multiple occasions and just said, boys, man, you wrestling with your identity, you're wrestling with your worthiness, you're wrestling with this whole idea that you can't be perfect. That's not you, that's me. That's my brokenness that God on you. In fact, what was really cool is a couple of weeks ago, I'm meeting with one of my older sons, and we're sitting there, and we had just gotten sideways a little bit, and he was going this way, and I'm kind of going this way, and I just said, hey, can we start over a little bit? And can we just kind of, begin from the beginning, and you just tell me your story. I just want to know your story from your perspective. And I said, tell me what it was like growing up in your home. And I know I'm your dad, but, just let's go along. And he looked at me and he said, well, Dad, I can, but I think you're going to get mad. And I said, well, I'll do everything I can just to create the safest place in the world for you to talk to me. And he began to share, and he just said, well, Dad, I'll just tell you, it was really hard. And I struggle a whole lot. with this time, and he shared these times and his worthiness and just like the demands, and it was never enough for you, Dad. And he goes, and Dad, you definitely have changed. I've seen that. And he goes, I'm so grateful for that, but the thing that makes it hard for me now as one of your older sons is I see the way that you parent Jonathan and Michael, which are our twin boys, they're 10. And I see the way that you're patient with them. I see the way that you lean into them. I see the way that you choose your words differently. And he goes, I'm so grateful for that. But he goes, what's hard for me is when I come home, I think, man, I wish that was me. I wish that was my childhood. And guys, that's so incredibly difficult to hear as a father. But on the other side of my son, I thought, I'm so grateful we're having this conversation. Because these are the kind of conversations that sons take with them for decade after decade after decade and never process. But I'm getting the privilege to be his father, to sit on the other side of him, to hear his heart, and to be able to look at him in his eyes and says, man, son, I'm so sorry. That was me, that was not you. Please forgive me. I'm just telling you what that does for his heart, what that does for my son's hearts. It's incredible, and it's so difficult, but it's so rewarding. And see, the danger in this, guys, the danger is that if you don't do the work, if you don't choose to be brave, if you don't choose to be vulnerable, then you'll never know the kind of husband you could have been. You'll never know the kind of wife you could have been. You'll never know the kind of father, the kind of mother you could have been. You'll never know perhaps what it would really feel like to be alive as a man, to be alive as a woman. There is something you can do right now, regardless of your season of life. What is it? Solomon says, above all else, man, guard your heart. What does that mean? Would you pause long enough in life just to answer the questions of what do I feel? How old do I feel? And who will I tell? I'm just telling you, that's the thing that begins to close the gap. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for today. Thank you for this time. Father, I know when we talk about things like this that there's so much history. There's such a bigger narrative at play in all of our lives. But God, I take comfort in the fact that you know that narrative. You know the security blankets we hold on to. You know what's going on in our hearts. So Father, would you meet each of us this week and the weeks beyond? Would you help us be brave? Would you help us take the steps to be vulnerable and begin to identify what's happening inside of us? Would you walk with us along that path? God, I trust you with that. And again, just thank you for this day. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.
It gets hard to breathe.